Well, welcome to First Fridays at Redeemer. It's so happy to see you. And now I know, thanks to Joan Gunderson, this is being recorded. And I want to tell you about the artist, Candace Burgess. I met her first when I still am teaching the piano class at Duquesne University, and she was in my class. And then she sang, she graduated from St. Edmund's Academy. So she knew Church of the Redeemer well, because there's a close relationship between Church of the Redeemer and St. Edmund's Academy. And I always remember she was the last person to sing before we closed for COVID. So it's just a great joy for all of us to have Candace back with us. So I would like to read to you her artist biography. Soprano Candace Burgess is a versatile vocal artist. The Pittsburgh native specializes in the styles of opera, classical, jazz, musical theater, and contemporary. She holds a Bachelor's of Music in Performance Voice from Duquesne University and is currently pursuing her master's in vocal performance at Duquesne University. While pursuing her degree, Candace is also developing and moderating a host of programming for organizations such as Creative Learning Network, Black Opera Alliance, Pittsburgh National Opera House, and I Too Sing, her personal endeavor. I Too Sing is a project focused on the celebrating the lives and works of composers of African descent through educational workshops and performances. As part of I Too Sing, Candace led a panel created for the Pittsburgh Festival Opera, I Too Sing, a conversation about the Black experience in opera, and produced and taught a 5-week virtual education program for the Creative Rapid Response Initiative called 5 Creole Songs as arranged by Camille Nickerson. This past August, Candace joined the Remake Learning Shifting Power Initiative as an educator, where she develops and tests future programming for I Too Sing. In addition to her projects, Candace also participated in 2 operas, Duquesne University's 2019 production of Die Fledermaus as Sally, Chicago Summer Opera's 2018 production of Die Zauberflöte as Third Knaben. Candace was also the lead vocalist in the Associates of the Boston Public Library's Giving Voice to the Abolitionists. So this is a very impressive resume already in her career. So if you have some questions that you would like to ask Candace, would you please put them in the chat? And at the end of the program, we will give her an opportunity to answer those questions. So Candace, welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Candace Burgess, and today I will be talking to you about the 5 Creole songs by Camille Nickerson, published in 1942. The 5 Creole songs are Camille Nickerson's adaptation of her people's music. The Creole song, also known as Louisiana cabin songs, are folk songs of the Afro-Creole people that were developed in Louisiana plantations during the French and Spanish rule. In an interview with Doris McGinty, Camille Nickerson further elaborates on this definition. The songs themselves were originated in much the same way as the spiritual on the plantations of Louisiana in the South. But these songs were peculiar to Louisiana. These people were under the domination of the French and Spanish colonists. They had their peculiar influences. The themes were different from spirituals. They never seemed to be sad songs. They're mostly love songs or lullabies, some satire. In addition, most if not all, the Creole songs are written in Koivini, which is a French-based language spoken in Louisiana, made up of French and several different African languages, and reflect cultural aspects of everyday life. Through the 5 Creole songs, we'll be taking a deep dive into the music and culture of the Afro-Creole people.
The songs we will be covering are as follows: Cher mon l'aime toi, or Dear I Love You So, Lisette ma chère amie, Lisette my dearest one, Danse koni kone, Dance baby dance, Fais dodo, Go to sleep, et Michel Banjo, Mr. Banjo. For each section of the 5 songs, we will 1. Listen to Camille Nickerson's thoughts on the song. 2. Listen to the song. And 3. Listen to Candace's thoughts on the song. And finally, we will conclude with an explanation why Creole songs are so important and a Q&A section.
Good afternoon and welcome. So good morning, welcome. The video didn't go as planned, but as said in the video, my name is Candace Burgess, and today we'll be talking about the 5 Creole songs. The first song we're going to start out with is Cher mon l'aime toi.
Dear I Love You Like a Pig Loves Mud is a gay tune sung a great deal on Mardi Gras Day, the last day of the carnival season, when a suitor, otherwise timid, could easily find the courage with which to declare his heart's longing to the one of his choice, since he was hidden by a mask in a complete disguise. The second strain of this song is, interestingly enough, a tune popular with the Americans and played by the bands when on parade. The Creoles, being intrigued by the melody, translated the words into their own vernacular and enjoyed singing it as much did the Americans. Dear, I love you like a pig loves. Dear, I love you like a pig loves mud.
So before moving on, I'm going to interject again. That video for some reason didn't play as planned as well. For each of these songs, you will have typically have subtitles. So for the Cher mon l'aime toi, the lyrics are as follows: Cher mon l'aime toi, which means Dear I Love You So. It repeats Cher mon l'aime toi, Dear I Love You So. Oui, mon l'aime toi. Yes, I love you. Tout mon cœur, with all my heart. Mon l'aime toi. I love you. And it repeats, Cher mon l'aime toi. Cher mon l'aime toi. Oui, mon l'aime toi. Yes, I love you. Comme un petit cochon l'aime la boue. Like a little pig loves mud. So it's a very joyous, kind of romantic and dramatic kind of song. Just saying, you know, I really love you. The B section is the song If I Ever Cease to Love, which is a very popular Mardi Gras song. And it was adapted from the Americans as said in the blurb. So essentially the words are, if ever I cease to love, I'll take my knife. Yes, take my knife. Take my knife and like cut my neck off if ever I cease to love. And there's a tradition of putting all types of different verses in that piece. So moving on, and just continuing on with my thoughts. That piece also reflects how essentially Mardi Gras was so important to the Afro Creoles. Mardi Gras was essentially the time in which Afro Creoles could feel a sense of freedom, right? They created their own traditions because Mardi Gras has been segregated. Basically, before 1996, Mardi Gras parades were heavily segregated. There weren't Black people allowed in crews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they created their own history and legacies. For example, the Mardi Gras Indians, the baby dolls, social aid and pleasure clubs, and things of that nature. And also just a little bit more about If Ever I Cease to Love.
Here, in late 1871, the handsome and tall 21-year-old Russian Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich Romanov started a goodwill tour of North America. When he was visiting St. Louis, he saw an actress named Lydia Thompson in a play, singing a novelty song called If Ever I Cease to Love. If ever I cease to love, if ever I cease to love, may the moon be turned into green cream cheese if ever I cease to love. People said that Alexei was smitten and pursued Lydia. Now, whether he did or didn't, we don't know, but the story got around. Fast forward 1 month. One of his last tour stops was New Orleans for Mardi Gras. A new crew called Rex had been formed to put on a daytime parade with a new king of carnival called, you guessed it, Rex. And because the Grand Duke was in town, and the actress Lydia just happened to be in town, and everyone had heard the rumors, the song If Ever I Cease to Love was played by every single band in the parade, and it became the anthem for Rex. Alexei, he didn't meet up with Lydia. They say he moved on to another actress. Then he left town. Lydia, she left town too, but the song, it stuck around. Now, it wasn't any great piece of music. It was fun, and you could add new verses. It became part of New Orleans, something simple that everybody could riff on in their own special way. And it's been recorded by musicians from George Lewis to Johnny Wiggs to John Rankin to Hazel the Delta Rambler. If ever I cease to love, if ever I cease to love, may the Grand Duke ride a buffalo, if ever I cease to love. For WWOZ, I'm Brian Batt.
This tricentennial music moment was
So the next selection we'll be covering is Lisette, ma chère amie.
Whenever a servant was needed in the household, personal attractions of the slave selected was largely a governing factor in making the choice. And so it was the beautiful Lisette who was taken from the plantation and sent to the city as a domestique. Her ardent suitor is thus grief-stricken, for he will probably never again look upon the face of his beloved one. In that romantic era, when love was an all-consuming factor in the lives of men and women, such a situation was indeed a tragedy.
New Orleans quite as much as the Atlantic slave trade. I'm here in front of St. Augustine's Church in the Tremaine neighborhood here in New Orleans. That right there, that cross, that is the tomb of the unknown slave. The chains are actually made of the anchor chains of slave ships, and some of the shackles that are hanging from it were used to bind people back during the 19th and 18th century. Now, to understand how the culture of New Orleans got going, you've got to understand the mercantile system of slavery. The French, who founded the city, and then the Spanish after them, they had a fundamental difference with the way that the Anglo-Americans did slavery, and it's a complicated issue, but basically here's what it comes down to. So the Americans, in particular, they were interested in creating a strictly racially stratified society as a means to maintain control over their slaves. They also put a cap on the number of slaves that they actually brought over from West Africa. The French and the Spanish, and I'd lump the Portuguese in there as well, didn't care quite so much about that. What they cared much more about was making as much money as quickly as possible. And again, to understand why, you've just got to look at the context here, the economics of the early modern era. Now, at least as an American, I tend to think of the sort of main slave crops being, rice during, early colonial times, then tobacco, and of course the big one, cotton. But what the French and the Spanish were cultivating here on the Gulf Coast and in the Caribbean made more money than those three crops combined, a substance that has changed all of our lives. In fact, you probably ingested it this morning. Sugarcane, which was then used to make, of course, sugar. Sugarcane was big business in the early modern era. Just to put a number on it for you, a little under 5% of slaves taken from West Africa and brought into the Western Hemisphere went to what we think of as the American South. 40% went to the Caribbean. A little over 40% went to the Portuguese colony of Brazil. And those slaves were mainly used to cultivate sugarcane. It was big money, man. Big business. And because people back in Europe couldn't stop shoving sugar into their faces, millions upon millions of people were enslaved and brought to the Americas.
Augustus, how does it make you feel to be the first golden ticket finder?
Hungry.
Basically, what this meant was that you had a huge population of slaves in these Caribbean and South American colonies that radically upset the demographics of those places. For example, Haiti.
Just to elaborate on the video, in order to understand the impact of the song, we have to understand that the place where the singer is coming from. He's coming from a society that heavily values sugarcane. So essentially, he's being subject to being in these sugarcane plantations, which is a very dangerous field. The whole processing of sugarcane is a very dangerous and long and arduous process. And there wasn't really virtually a way out if you're a slave, specifically cutting cane. There's a way for Lizette out because she went to become a domestique or a domestic servant, wherein she had the ability to buy herself, because a lot of times the domestiques would rent out their services in order to be able to buy themselves. But our singer doesn't necessarily have that opportunity, and therefore he's grief-stricken and is trying all these types of ways to stop Lizette from going to the city, telling her she's going to meet this grand chief who is deceptive, and he tricks women, and he looks really sweet, but he really is a snake. He's grief-stricken. He really wants to be with his love and understands that this might be the last time he sees his love ever again. So just some food for thought as we move on.
In the late 18th century, slaves outnumbered free people in Haiti by a factor of almost 2 to 1. At that point, you just do the math, right? Look at how many of us there are. There's only one man with a whip over there. We should murder him. And it's just common sense, right? It's human nature. And the Haitian Revolution of 1791 did begin as a slave revolt. It was the only successful black slave revolt in history. And it was a democratic revolution, very much inspired by the same ideals that had inspired the American and later the French Revolution. Didn't turn out nearly as well as the American Revolution did, though. A little over 10 years later, Haiti had become a genocidal dictatorship, but that's neither here nor there. Specifically in New Orleans, what this mercantile system of slavery meant was, well, several things. First of all, when the Americans came, they were horrified by what they saw as a sort of lax and permissive sort of mixing of the races, and they would try very hard to separate the races, really up until the Civil Rights Movement. Now, the mercantile system of slavery meant that a large population of free people of color was here in New Orleans, the largest anywhere in the American South. Many of these people were of mixed race. Now, I talked about this a little bit when I talked about Marie Laveau in that video, but there was this system that these white colonists had in place called plissage, which basically was a sort of form of systemic concubinage, essentially, where these black women would be basically given as mistresses to these white boys, and sometimes they would be with them for decades, and their children could, in certain cases, actually inherit some, if not all, of this white man's wealth, especially if their placé, their mistress, was mixed race, an eighth or a quarter African American. In that case, their son would look essentially white. And so then, perhaps if that guy, never got married, or if he didn't, to a white woman, he didn't like any of his other kids or whatever, then he would sort of, give his inheritance to his black son. Now, once, though, the black...
The idea of the people of color, just interjecting it again, is going to come back up towards the end of our recital. This also kind of helps inform why Lizette might have been picked, because there was this practice of owners tending to be with their slaves in a more passive way. Because Louisiana was a French and Spanish colony, they were navigated by different laws. Those laws were called the Code Noir for the French, and especially the Spanish took the Code Noir and added a few different rules and called it the Código Negro, which translates to the same thing, the Black Code Black.
Son kind of came to power, he would just sort of brush it under the rug about his mother's lineage. Oh, we don't talk about her in this house, that sort of thing. But what this sort of facilitated was that you had a lot of mixed race, free people of color during slavery operating in positions of surprising authority. I mean, doctors, lawyers, operating in service to the upper crust of the white elite. Some of them even were sort of in and amongst the white elite. Many of them.
Moving on.
Were plantation owners. In fact, the man who owned the most slaves in Louisiana history was a free man of color. Now, there was also a certain amount of
The nursery song, so well known among American children, seems to be absent from the musical literature thus far found in researches into Creole song. When amusing the baby, the nurse sang whatever happened to come into her mind at the moment, sometimes adding thoughts of her own to the melody already begun. Thus, the potato referred to, most likely the favorite sweet potato, may or may not have been cooking at the time. However, the words fit perfectly into the gay, rhythmic beat of the song. The nurseries.
So what's interesting about Louisiana is the fact that in slavery, a lot of times families were actually able to stay together. So on a plantation, it wouldn't be necessarily uncommon to see a great grandfather who came from Africa, and then all of his children and his grandchildren and all those kind of things would be in the plantation. However, it heavily depended on who your master was. Everything was different because depending on who your master was. But the thought was for a lot of slave owners to keep all the slaves together so they would not revolt. Louisiana, the purpose for slaves in Louisiana was a little bit different at the beginning of the colonization, the slaves were brought in to help feed the colony. At the time of, during its first couple of years, at least first decade, Louisiana was really struggling to actually make it as a colony. There was a good amount of times where they didn't really have food to eat. So they brought in slaves essentially from the Senegambia region, which is a region in West Africa wherein a lot of actually big empires were. For example, the Empire of Benin was there. And the Senegambia people were very brilliant people. They had, but specifically, they had a very good knowledge of being good planters and had some, and were able to plant in regions kind of like Louisiana. Some of their homelands are similar to Louisiana. They grew indigo, and they grew rice. They actually brought over their rice, with the first shipment of slaves that they brought to Louisiana. So it was very practical as to why they came. And the slaves, because they knew how indigo grew, they also helped to cultivate the indigo that was there too. So that's just an interesting note. Now we're going into Fedodo.
In Fedodo, we have an example of the common practice resorted to by many Creole mothers of frightening the child in order to force it into prompt obedience. In an urban community, the boogeyman, often called the boogeyman, is frequently invoked, whereas in a rural environment, the wagon load of sheep and the great big wolf are objects of fright.
So before we move on, just a few of my thoughts. I want to address that there is a practical reason as to why specifically Afro-Creole mothers used tall tales to scare their children. They weren't just like, in many cultures is a common practice, but it was very tactical because they grew up in a racist society. Specifically for women of color, to be able to teach your child that not everything can be safe in a way that is palatable is super important the youngest you can, because you can't necessarily protect your child in every circumstance. So all of these pieces had a very practical reason. To be able to be afraid of the boogeyman meant you could be afraid of something without knowing the actual systematic root reasons of something. That's a protection. And that's a seed of protection, being able to be like, just be able to trust your family, being able to trust that there's certain things that you can't quite understand. It doesn't really make sense as to why it is the way it is. But you can be afraid for it so you can make sure that you're okay. And also, it's a double-edged sword because while it's protection, it enforces the norm. So while you're trying to fight it, it's complex. It's complex. And finally, Monsieur Banjo. Now, Monsieur Banjo is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be listening to the same song twice, but there's a very good reason as to why.
Monsieur Banjo, Mr. Banjo, the town dandy, is the envy of those who have neither his fine clothes nor his talent for entertaining on the banjo. Moreover, the envious pang is certainly not softened by the fact that he is a mulatto. Hence, Mr. Banjo is the victim of much ridicule.
So, seems pretty straightforward, right? But as I said, as I was kind of starting to point out with the previous selection, there's a lot more complexities and a lot more things going on underneath the surface. So I thought this song was straightforward when I originally started learning it. However, when I started to dig more into it and translate it, I found a lot of weird things. specifically with the translation. The first video that you've seen is Camille Nickerson's translation of this piece. And the next version you're going to see is my translation of this piece. Just to give some context, I usually try to translate as close to the original, like word for word text as possible, so I can convey the meaning closest to what was originally intended and said. So I don't usually take many poetic liberties just to be authentic and true to the text. So my text is probably gonna be pretty accurate. And you'll see a kind of jarring difference in some ways. So pay close attention to the text. So quite a difference. It reads a lot differently with like the original translation. With the original more closer to like the original translation. Essentially, the song comes off a lot meaner. It's a lot more pointed than originally intended. And that confused me originally. It kind of confused me, but it kind of didn't. I was trying to figure out why did she not translate it in correctly? I couldn't quite understand. I couldn't quite put my hands around it until I started to think again about the history of the Creoles of color. And just pulling that back in from earlier, the Creoles of color had a very interesting role in Louisiana. Louisiana wasn't a two-caste black and white system. It was three. During Spanish rule, after the French left, after the first occupation of Louisiana, Spain came in and introduced a new law called the Corazon, and essentially it gave slaves opportunity to buy their own freedom. So because slaves are able to buy their own freedom, the population of Creoles of color started to increase, much in like places like Haiti, which they had a very big Creole of color population, or people who have mixed race, mixed background. And it's also heavily conflated with free people of color, because free people of color were the people who bought their own slavery through the Corazon. And slowly they kind of became conflated with the free people of color, who are specifically like the what we most often consider Creole, people of mixed race, African, Latin, French, German, that kind of mixed ancestry. And those who had that kind of mixed ancestry kind of worked in this middle ground between Black and white. And they had privilege in that space. So it made life very interesting, especially in slavery. Actually, I think one of the biggest slave owners was a Creole of color. So there's a lot of tension, especially after slavery, after the Civil War, that kind of caste system kind of broke down. And because of they were getting more and more Americanized, Creole colors were having a tough time trying to figure out where they were, where their position was, and who they were. Some identify as Black now, some still identify as Creole color, but there's still a lot of tension because of that history of domination, because there are Black people in Louisiana that see them as essentially denying their Blackness and just trying to act better than other Black people. And I have a little documentary about this told through the perspective of Creole of color people.
A confused young man looked at his parent, that's French Creole for godfather, and asked, "What am I? Who am I? Who are my ancestors' kin? I'm fair, my brother's brown, and my sister's of olive skin. My mama says Creole. What is that? Am I supposed to know?"
A typical Creole family was a family mixed with white, Black, a touch of Spanish, and in some cases a bit of Indian blood. And I think that can count a lot of New Orleans families like that. The disadvantages, because we were just a little different, some people didn't take to that. They gave us a rough time sometimes. The advantage, my daddy went into the painting business, and I hate to say it, but on many occasions, he didn't tell the people what he was. They accepted him for the way he looked. Some cases people found out later, but once you've worked for them, if they liked your work, then you would be called back. If you were real dark-skinned, often they wouldn't give you the chance to get in the front door.
The Creole is like the prototype of a melting pot man. He has a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So I think what makes Creole is that you have to recognize that you are part of many ethnicities. You're not totally African American. You're not totally French. You're not totally Spanish. You're a combination of everything. And I think recognizing that diversity is unique because you say, this is who I am. You accept me the way I am. I have no control over the fact that I have 7 ethnic groups in 3 generations.
We are mixture of Caucasians and Africans that's in the family, both on mother's side of the family, on my daddy's side of the family. So you might say we are thoroughbred Creoles. One thing I can remember, my mother on the telephone, when she talked to her sisters, they always spoke in French. And of course, whenever they were talking about me, I knew because they couldn't say Lord in French. So I always got a kick out of that.
Honey, we went from dark brown to blue-eyed blondes. My sister was a platinum blonde as a child, a blonde with blue eyes. And I have first cousins that are dark brown skin. I had one uncle that was brown and 3 uncles that were fair. One had blue eyes. Naturally, the brown one was teased and talked about as a kid because they do that in their own families. They call them the black sheep of the family and things like that.
Many of the children of darker complexions felt inferior. These children never fully were able to enjoy being children. They were so busy worrying about what they looked like. If you were brown, but you had nice hair, you know, if your hair would move, if you had good hair, well then you were with that crowd with the light skin, who may not have had nice hair, but they had the fair skin. So there was a lot of categorizing, and the children who felt inferior, they carried this forever.
Remember, the Creole word to some people, they get really upset over it. One of my coworkers, I mentioned that word just a few weeks ago, and he told me, he said, that's when you want to be white and you don't want to be black. But to some extent, we are in the middle. We don't want to be uppity. All I want to do is live my life and go on.
My daddy was a very independent person. He loved business. He loved dairy farming. He loved cows. My father received a tax bill for $600 on the farm and the cattle and whatever. He met with with Judge Adams and protested, and he said since he did not have schools for his children, he didn't see why he had to pay it. He said if he had to pay it, he would send his children to that school, that white school right down the highway. Judge Adams told him for $3,000, I'll have all y'all records changed and everybody will be white. And he told him go to hell, and that was it.
How can I really know how I came to be? How come we're different complexions? What am I supposed to see? Parrain, the youth besieged him. Tell me, why are we so many colors? What does Creole really mean? Who can I call my brothers? Am I black or white? I do not understand. What is my true birthright?
And since we're running a little bit low on time, I'll just so essentially, why it's important to study these songs? Well, because at the time that Creole Nickerson started radio studies, even the language that the songs are written in is a culture and language that deserves to be taken. How many scratch the surface with that of all the history, the big chunk of as white in the way also not like some of the language specific things essentially.
Candace, when you're speaking, would you be a little closer to your microphone? Your voice is fading in and out.
Yes. But partially, I want to bring light to this history, this wonderful history that all of us know. So thank you, and I would love to answer your questions.
There was, Anne, are you going to unmute so that you can get the ones out of the chat list?
Yes, Candace, we want to thank you so much for this very enlightening program, both the singing and the historical context of it, things that we just simply did not know. There were two main questions in the chat, which I'd like to share with you now. The first one came at the very beginning of your program. The person asked, the opera house that's being renovated in the Hill District, can you speak a little bit about that?
The Opera House, National Negro Opera House is at 707 Apple Street in Homewood. The house is, I mean, I'm advocating for the house. I'm currently not as involved as I was because I'm doing a lot of other things. However, Miss Denise Graves, Joanne Solomon, Jeanette Solomon, everybody's doing such a great job to work and
Right.
get the house funded and make it a historical landmark and revive it and create it into a museum. So I'm very proud, and I believe that it will get done at this point. They've raised $500,000 thus far, so their goal is 2 million. So
Yeah, there was an article in a magazine, a Pittsburgh magazine, about that a few months ago.
And they're having a play, I believe, premiered at Glimmerglass Festival this summer.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
And then the second question was, Mr. Banjo, that song, did that become the minstrel style?
That's a question I've gotten before. I do not believe so. I would need to do more research about it, but I don't believe it became minstrel. The piece actually was written for a very famous, it was the piece is dedicated to a very famous baritone, black baritone, operatic black baritone named William Henry. So I'm assuming it might have become a minstrel song, but I don't think it became a minstrel song. I would have to do more research on that, but I haven't seen that thus far.
Are there any other questions that anyone? Yes, Marlene has a question.
It just so happens that my book club is reading a book about slavery called The Yellow Wife. Now, this is about slavery in Virginia, and it may be a little closer to the Civil War than what you were talking about, the Creoles, but a lot of the same situations, although it sounds as if the Southern, in Louisiana, which happens to be where my granddaughter was born, and I saw a lot of Mardi Gras crews, was different than the further north. I'm not sure about that, because she does mention in the book about buying your freedom, except the slave owners did everything they could to impede that. You know, they were not happy about slaves
it was
buying their freedom.
Different. Like I said, it depends on your slave owner.
Yeah.
But it wasn't necessarily different in Louisiana. It depended on like in the rest of the South, it depended on who the owner was. It also depended on what country you're in, because Louisiana became part of the United States when Louisiana purchased, which was still during slavery.
Still slavery.
So once Louisiana, I didn't get to touch on this in this particular program, but Louisiana became a hub for the segregated slave trade after being bought by Louisiana purchase, it became a food hub for slaves raised in other families. There's a whole NPR podcast about that. So despite the fact that Louisiana had some interesting histories, it still wasn't great. It still was slavery.
Yes.
It's still functioned in a way that I don't think any of us could even use it now.
And then you mentioned sugarcane. I read this book about this fellow named Diaz, and he tells about his mother. I think it was in Haiti, but I could be wrong. About that's where she started in the sugarcane fields, and just what you said of how awful it was and how badly they were treated. And they were natives. I don't think he wasn't Creole or anything. It was just horrible conditions and dangerous job.
Sugarcane is a very dangerous industry, especially for, even before automation, both were dangerous, but it was dangerous in a different way. Because they were long doing hours. You have to cut sugarcane like all day, like 24 hours, 20 hours. You're working 3-hour days. They wake you up really early. Plus, for those who are doing the actual processing of the sugar cane, it was supreme danger because there were costs. People who can and eat. The average death, specifically like in Jamaica where they were eating a lot of sugar cane, for those who worked in the processing, they had like an average lifespan of like 20, 30. So it was extremely dangerous. All these things were very extremely dangerous to be a part of.
Well, this has been the most fascinating First Friday, and I'm so grateful to you, Candace, for sharing all of your wisdom, your beautiful voice, and the historical background of all of this with us. We hope that we'll hear you sing again, and we look forward to more of your research. And I thank all of you for coming.
Thank you so much for all this.
Gotta speak to them.
And our next First Friday will be in the fall, and it will be a live presentation at Church of the Redeemer. So I will be sending you more information about that. And I thank you all so much for coming. Bravo to you, Candace. I'm so proud of you, and I just love hearing you speak and hearing you sing. And this, you can be able to listen to this again because it will be archived on our website.